welcome you to this Emotional Life speaker series. This Emotional Life premiered in January as a three-part documentary series on PBS, and it continues for the next 2 years as a national outreach campaign to foster awareness, connections, and solutions around emotional well-being. Spearheaded by Paul G. Allen's Vulcan Productions and NOVA WGBH Science Unit, the overriding goal of this public service effort is to help destigmatize mental health issues and bring greater understanding about the emotional barriers and pathways to happiness. We hope that you'll help us in this effort by first telling us what you think. After today's webinar, you'll receive a short survey that we hope you'll take a minute to answer so that we can better serve you and others in this campaign. And then we hope you'll stay involved and tell a friend. Become a fan on our Facebook page, read our expert blogs, and recommend new bloggers, forward our newsletters to those you care about,
Hello?
and of course attend our future webinars. Hello? We are live. Hello? I believe
Hi, can you hear me?
I can
hey,
hear
it's Holly.
you.
Can you hear me?
I think everyone can hear you. This is
Yay.
Shanna. Hi.
You need to call in as well?
Yeah, everyone's on. Everyone's on, and I'm making the introductions right now to introduce you all.
Okay, I'm calling in now.
So just to everyone, yeah, everyone can hear. Okay, well, with that, I will make the introductions to today's webinar. Today's speaker series explores what it means to grow up with autism. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Geraldine Dawson, who's a research professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as well as the Chief Science Officer at Autism Speaks. Autism Speaks was founded 5 years ago by Bob and Suzanne Wright, grandparents of a child with autism. Since then, Autism Speaks has grown into the nation's largest autism science and advocacy organization, dedicated to funding research into the causes, prevention, treatments, and a cure for autism, increasing awareness of autism spectrum disorders, and advocating for the needs of individuals with autism and their families. With that, I turn the discussion over to Jerry Dawson, who will be introducing all of the panelists today.
Thank you very much, Shannon. I also want to express my appreciation for your focusing on autism as part of your series. Today we have 4 people that are part of our panel. So in addition to myself, we are fortunate to have an expert on early intervention and on the development of social skills in children. This is Connie Kasari. She is a professor and director of the Center for Autism Research at UCLA. We also have with us Holly Robinson-Peete, who I'm sure most of you are very aware of her as a well-known actress and also a mother of a child with an autism spectrum disorder. And then finally, we have on our panel John Elder Robeson. John is a self-described person with Asperger's syndrome and also the author of books that have described his own experience growing up with autism. So we hope to provide you several different perspectives on what it means to grow up with autism. And I'm going to begin the discussion by starting at the first part of life and talking about early detection. So as you may know, autism is a very heterogeneous group of neurodevelopmental disorder. There's a very wide spectrum and many different ways that autism can be manifest. But the thing that is common across all individuals who have this condition is a difficulty in the area of social relationships and communication. Most people with autism have trouble with the development of spoken language, but also in the use of what we call nonverbal language. So reading body cues and interpreting meaning out of social and facial expressions, using gesture and so forth. So that's why we think of autism as fundamentally a communication disorder. In addition, people with autism often exhibit what we call stereotyped or restricted or repetitive behaviors. And this simply means that people with autism often have areas of interest where they may be overly focused on a topic or a specific interest, or they may actually engage in repetitive behaviors. These can be either stereotyped motor movements or rituals or other kinds of repetitive routines. Now, we know that autism is no longer a rare condition. When I first started out in the field over 2 decades ago, I was the Northwest's only expert in autism because it was a rare condition, and most pediatricians never saw a child with an autism spectrum disorder. But the new statistics are telling us that autism affects about 1% of all children in the United States. So the CDC last year published new prevalence estimates that autism affects 1 in 110 individuals. Now, if we compare that to some other conditions, such as type 1 diabetes, which is 1 in 400, childhood cancer, 1 in 2,000, cystic fibrosis, 1 in 3,500, you can see that autism is really a major public health challenge. In fact, this year, more children will be diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder than AIDS, diabetes, and cancer combined. And so we really are urging our federal government, this is part of Autism Speak's major lobbying efforts, to try to provide more funding not only for research but for services for people with autism. And we're also very involved in advocating for better insurance coverage for autism services. Now, currently, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that all children be screened for autism spectrum disorder at their 18 and 24-month-old well baby checkup. However, unfortunately, the average age still is about 4 or 5 years of age in terms of when children are diagnosed. And in fact, if you are from an ethnic minority background, such as individuals who are African American or Hispanic, the delay in getting a diagnosis is even greater. So we have a huge gap between what's recommended for screening and the actual use of these screening methods in pediatric practice. And so this is a need that clearly needs to be addressed. What we know, however, is that parents are really good at noticing the symptoms in their own children. In fact, they're usually the first ones to notice that the baby might not be making eye contact or engaging in social games or beginning to use babble. And so they often go to the pediatrician and they bring this up, but many times they're told, well, let's just wait and see, or he's a boy and maybe that's why he's late in developing. But what we encourage parents is to continue to seek out an evaluation if they have those concerns. You can go on the Autism Speaks website and there's a video that shows exactly what these symptoms look like, and really persevere in trying to find an evaluation for your child if you do have concerns. Now, fortunately, researchers are developing some good tools for screening. So the second one that you see listed on your screen there is called the Modified Checklist for Autism in Toddlers. And this is really well validated. It's the one of a few different screening tools that pediatricians can use at that 18 and 24-month-old checkup. It's a simple parent questionnaire that's combined with a follow-up question or phone call if the parent is indicating that some symptoms are present. In addition, we're now developing a new inventory called the first-year inventory that can be used as with babies that are as young as 12 months of age. So we do see that in some babies that they are showing symptoms by 1 year of age, and so this questionnaire is asking about those symptoms. In fact, Autism Speaks just funded a study to continue to validate this questionnaire that potentially could be used by pediatricians at 1 year of age. Now, here's some examples of some of the questions that you might see on that first-year inventory. Does your baby turn to look at you when you call your baby's name? What do you typically have to do to get your baby to smile? Does your baby babble? Is the baby oversensitive to touch? What are the baby's sleeping and waking patterns like? Is your baby difficult to calm? And does your baby tend to play alone for a long time and not seek out that social interaction? So if parents are indicating that several of these symptoms are present, then we want to make sure that we have a full diagnosis and begin early intervention right away. Now, I thought I would just stop at this point and ask Holly to tell me a little bit about her own experience with going to the pediatrician and seeking out a diagnosis. Holly, what was this like for you?
Jerry, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. very honored to be on this webinar call. Our experience in the Pete family was very interesting. We didn't see a lot of the first-year warning signs of autism. We saw our son pretty much hitting all the milestones alongside his twin sister up until around the age of 2. And then there was sort of what we call this a dramatic regression into autism. It's quite possible that in hindsight he could have been showing some of these symptoms, but we didn't really notice them until about 2 years old, when he ceased answering to his name and ceased making eye contact and pointing. So, you know, we as parents, we were a little confused and scared, and, you know, we didn't know what was going on. But when we took him to the pediatrician, that my loud and clear mommy gut was screaming at me saying something was up. And our pediatrician, bless his heart, and he certainly meant well, but really sort of dragged along for a year with he's just a boy, he'll be fine, boys are slower, they grow. Because remember, we're comparing him to his twin sister at the same time. And I think it was a little frustrating for me because I knew something was going on, and I did see some of these things at around the age of 2. We finally did get a diagnosis at 3 years old, at which point I rolled up my sleeves and started to try to do everything I could to try to intervene, because a fairy godmother told me early intervention was key. So we felt blessed to have that. But I think that probably the narrative of our experience, Jerry, would probably be that mom knew something was going on. Pediatrician wasn't looking outside of the box or thinking outside of the box. And like you said, you know, in all fairness, this was 10 years ago, which doesn't seem like a very long time, but even then we weren't really seeing as many children on the spectrum as we do now. So maybe it is quite possible that it could have been just a boy experiencing boy things. But in our case, we finally did get the diagnosis at 3, at which point we started with intense intervention.
Oh, thank you, Holly. And, you know, I think you bring up a really important point, which is that generally speaking, we think about 2 general patterns of how we see symptoms of autism starting to emerge early in life. And one pattern is the pattern where we start to see symptoms as early as sometimes 8 months of age. The baby might not be orienting when their name is called, and they may not be paying as much attention to people. But about 25% of the time, and maybe even more, children develop really fairly normally. They may have very mild difficulties, but certainly don't have autism. And then somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd year of life, they lose those skills and have a regression. So it sounds like that, in your case, Holly, this was the pattern that your son showed.
That's correct. That's exactly what happened, and that I think causes a lot of frustration for parents, because you just have this moment, this sort of moment which you can't explain, and then you start seeking answers. And but the biggest blessing was that, you know, when we get an opportunity to get an early intervention kicked in, I really had to look at it as like a blessing, that and stop beating myself up for that 1 year of intervention that I felt like I'd missed at the age of 2.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I think we all want parents to just quickly get referred and be able to start that intervention right away. One thing I wanted to point out here, you'll see on your screen, is we do have on our website at Autism Speaks something called the First 100 Days Kit, and it's in both Spanish and English. This is downloadable, or you can also have it just sent to you as a hard copy. What do you do in the first 100 days after your child receives an autism diagnosis? And this is a point where parents are feeling pretty overwhelmed. There's lots of new information that they have to try to understand. And this kit can help you kind of get started and learn the language and know where to turn. So I hope if you yourself have just received a diagnosis, or you know someone who has, that you'll take advantage of this kit and that it will be helpful to you. So I just want to say a couple words about early intervention, and I'm going to turn it over to one of the other experts on the line. So this is what Holly was talking about, this need and importance of early intervention. And there's a few just general principles that need to be kept in mind. One is we do want to start as early as possible. That's why you have to just persevere to get that diagnosis if you're concerned about your child. We also know children are very different. It's not a cookie cutter where one size fits all. You often have to kind of tailor the intervention so that it fits your child. But whatever intervention that you receive, it's really important that these are overseen by trained professionals. One of the most common types of intervention is something called applied behavior analysis, or ABA. It's a broad range of different interventions that encompass lots of different techniques. But in each case, what they're doing is breaking down all the skills of early development, things like eye contact and play and language, and teaching those skills in small pieces and really addressing those autism-specific issues and teaching the child to really develop their social and language skills. And kids very much benefit from these, can have a huge impact in terms of outcome. So we also know that these interventions need an ongoing assessment, and that if the child is not making progress, you need a set of professionals to be adjusting their strategies. We know that kids need to be engaged throughout the intervention. You know, when we think about typical kids, they're learning every moment of the day, except for when they're sleeping and napping. So we want kids to really be engaged and actively processing information and learning as many of their waking hours as possible. The recommendation is that children with autism should receive at least 25 hours a week of structured intervention, and this can be being in a developmental preschool, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, or one-on-one ABA and other kinds of early interventions. And then finally, we know that it's so important to involve families. Families are the experts. They're really the center of everything that goes on. And we know that families can quickly learn strategies to help their children to develop language and social interaction. And their involvement is in the whole process, and using these strategies at home is really critical and very helpful, not only to the parent, but certainly to the child as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Kasari, who will tell us some about some of the difficulties that we see early on for children with autism, and then some of her work on treatment and social skills development.
Hi,
Connie?
thank you. Yes, hi, I'm here.
Okay.
Right, so I think the early signs of autism that Jerry and Holly talked about lead to some very characteristic early differences in children. And these differences have been really well documented in research over the last probably 20 years. One of those areas concerns the ability to share attention or to direct the attention of others. So children may not bring something to the parent to show them, or they may not share smiles and looking or seem as connected as much as other children do. And they also play with toys in very particular ways. They may not engage very much with toys at all, or they may play with them in ways that are always the same or that don't really involve other people. Play may not be very pretend-like. And so these are very early differences that those early signs sort of develop into, and that we really want to treat in terms of intervention. So some of the most, I think, exciting developments we've had of late are these models of early intervention, which is the next slide actually, that really target these core developmental issues in children. And what we know is that children are making really large gains in communication and language abilities when we target these very difficulties that children are showing. And both the targeted interventions and also more the comprehensive interventions that Jerry talked about, where we actually provide treatment for, say, 25 hours per week. So these are very autism specific, but they're also very developmentally appropriate. So those are kind of exciting new promises in improving outcomes for children. Do you want me to keep going, Jerry?
Well, I thought it might be helpful, Holly, again, if you could tell us about your son's experience with early intervention and the gains that he made and maybe the types of interventions that you found helpful.
Well, I would say that we were very fortunate to have a really nice team of people that we were able to connect with. We didn't have that 100-day kit. Boy, we could have used that. And so there was a lot of, we did have some people that were in our corner, but it was a very difficult scenario to navigate. And I would just say that because I know so many parents can get a little frustrated. But the 100-day kit, I just can't say enough about having a little bit of a roadmap, a template to follow. So I'm so appreciative of Autism Speaks for having that. You know, all of the things, the practices in early intervention that were listed are all things that we tried and all things that, you know, many of them worked for us. I would just say that probably the most difficult part of navigating the early intervention was really getting family on board and getting society on board somewhat. So everything else went very well for us as far as individualizing our son RJ's needs and coming up with a curriculum. We were fortunate to have a school, a preschool, which is dedicated for children on the spectrum, really come up with a curriculum. You were saying, Jerry, about the 25 hours a week and more than that. That's probably the most trying part because there is so much time that is needed for intervention. But we definitely were on schedule with that. Trying to keep our son engaged, trying to keep him learning, trying to, in essence, keep him in the neurotypical world, if you will, and try to keep him there for extended periods of time. We found that it was very effective. And again, going back to being blessed with an early diagnosis, we found that we were able to really help him navigate the world around him a little bit better through all of these interventions, a combination of many different ones. I mean, we tried applied behavioral analysis. We also did the Stanley Greenspan's method. I mean, we just really pretty much tried everything. That, I would say, is probably one of the more difficult areas of when you're getting a diagnosis because you don't know what to try first. And I would only say that you have to follow your gut and see what's working for your child and then, double down on that and continue in increments as much as you can to try other things. All children are different and they'll all respond to different experiences. So I will say that we've been fortunate, again, to have so many people in our corner, and I would only wish that for everybody.
Well, thank you, Holly. I really appreciate your sharing that experience with us, and I couldn't agree more that the whole process is so individualized and that parents really need to be at the helm, and they're the ones, I think, that can often make the best decision about what's working best for their child. What we'd like to do is to continue through development here and talk some about the challenges that children face as they move from the world of early intervention and preschool and start entering into elementary school and even adolescence. And of course, then peers are really front and center of what children need to learn how to interact with. So Connie Dr. Kasari has done some excellent work in this area, so I'm going to turn it back over to her so she can tell us about her work in the area of peers and friendship.
Okay, well, what's interesting about early intervention is that we've had so much success at helping children get into just the regular, general education school, and that's been really great. But the kids are really having difficulty in terms of peer relationships and friendships at school. And it really turns out to be a fairly underserved population. So we think of the children as having arrived because they get to go into regular kindergarten, but then they still struggle with their relationships at school. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that one of the things that we have been doing is asking kids in classrooms to tell us who hangs out with whom. And from that kind of information, we can draw maps, which is what you see on the left-hand side. And a map tells us who's involved in what kinds of social groups. So the goal for children in schools is to be connected to their classmates, excuse me, and feeling like they have friends or kids to play with on the playground. And so these maps really give you a lot of information about who's included in groups and who might not be. And what we found with kids with and without autism is that the children with autism who are in just the general education classroom tend to be less included in these maps or these groups of kids, but they're not as overwhelmingly isolated as one might have expected. So some children are not nominated to different groups, but most of the kids are what we think of as more peripheral to the group. So they're kind of connected to a group, but they're not really centrally integrated into that group. And so what we know from having done this now with lots of different classrooms, lots of different schools, and quite a few, probably about 100 children with autism, is that in a very brief, sort of short-term intervention, we can actually make changes so that if we go into the school and we try to facilitate whatever that child's individual need is in terms of playing with others on the playground, that we can get them more connected to groups. And we also find out that the peers will nominate them to groups as well. And so that's very encouraging. But one of the things that we've really learned is that to do this, we really need to be on school campuses, and that's very difficult for researchers to get involved and to actually do the work at school. But I think what you'll learn about also are that parents can be involved in some of these interventions, and that parent involvement in setting up play dates with their children can actually have an effect on children in schools. So I think this is some of the newest data that Fred Frankel has, and I don't think you have that on the slide, Jerry, but it's kind of interesting that parents who had more successful play dates at home with their children, actually those children looked more engaged on the playgrounds at school. So that's new and promising data.
Oh, that's really great, and it's I think encouraging to hear that those play days at home can really generalize to kids' experiences at school. You know, I think it would be great to hear from John, as a person who's grown up with an autism spectrum disorder, to hear a little bit about your experience, John, when you were in elementary school and adolescence, and how it was for you trying to understand the social world and develop friendships. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when I was little, it was very difficult because I could see that I was a failure socially, while at the same time I saw other kids my age being successful. And when you look at the slide on the screen of the map of the classroom connections, I could see those connections in the other children. Like each other kid was friends with every other kid, but I was only friends with 2 or 3 kids. And I certainly saw that, and to me it was an obvious sign of my own deficiency. But I couldn't tell exactly what was deficient about me. And that's where practical behavioral advice comes in. When I raised my son, who's also on the spectrum, he's another Asperger fellow like me, I was able to watch him with his own social failures and pick him up and say, you know, do this or don't do that so that you will not alienate those other kids. And that was tremendously successful for us. I guess that's sort of like the talk of having a successful play date being predictive of having success on the playground. I made a real effort to do that with my own son.
Oh, that's great. And so you used your own learning experience to help your son. I think that's beautiful. So can you tell me a little bit about what it was that was so challenging in terms of trying to develop friendships? Was it that you had trouble reading the cues, or you didn't quite know how to approach another child? What was the kind of difficulty you experienced, John?
I wanted to make friends in a sort of a vague sense, but I didn't know exactly how to do it. So I would try and go up to a kid and sort of draw them into my world with what I was doing, and they would think like I was kind of rude, or I was barging in, or I was interrupting, and those exchanges tended to fail because I didn't understand there was a flow to other conversations. So like today as an adult, I can walk up to some people talking, and they're talking about something in their lives, and I stand there for a moment and I'm acknowledged, and I then have a chance to speak up and say what I'm thinking about, and I have to, join in a relevant way. I didn't understand that as a 4-year-old, so I would just kind of barge in, and that strategy led to failure. Other times, kids would come up and say something to me, and again, I didn't understand that when a kid said, "Look at my truck, I like elephants," was not a valid response. It's seemingly obvious today, but I didn't know those things then because I didn't have any knowledge of autism or behavior. And that's what I tried to help my son with. I didn't tell him vague things like autism makes you different. I told him specific things like when a kid comes up and asks you about his dump truck, you talk to him about his dump truck and not about your Legos.
Wow, that's so well stated, John. I think it really helps us all understand better, what autism is like, and some of the struggles you had, and also some of your solutions. I think that was very, very helpful.
One thing that a lot of people don't understand, because it's not intuitively obvious, when you're a kid, you assume that every grown-up can do everything you can do the way you do it, but better. So if, for example, I had a problem looking in people's eyes and it made me uncomfortable, I would look up at your eyes and I'd look back down again because that's how I was most comfortable. I naturally assumed that you and every other grown-up did the same thing. So when you would say something to me like, "Look at me when I talk to you," I would look up at you for a second, look back down, and I would assume that's the only kind of compliance there can be because you and I must be the same. It's only now as an adult that I realize that there are different ways of being and other people can gaze steadily into each other's eyes. And when you're an adult and you look at a kid who might have autism, the same is true. You tend to assume, if I think this way, that boy is just a little version of me and he must think the same way. And that's not always true.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think, in the research world, we call that developing a theory of mind, or the idea that we develop an understanding of other people's perspectives and behaviors and feelings and intentions, and that can be, I think, sometimes very challenging for people on the autism spectrum. So I wanted to just say a few things about some of the new research that is being published that addresses how we can help children who have difficulties in the area of social interaction. And what we're finding is that there's really several different types of social skills training programs that can be really effective in helping children navigate the social world. And they're really using strategies very much like John just described, where these are not vague descriptions that we're giving to kids about how to develop friendships, but really very concrete behavioral skills that help children be more successful as they enter the social world. And what we're finding is that these social skills programs are particularly effective if they're conducted interacting with another child. So what we don't want to do is pull a child out and just work with them as an adult. We really want to be helping to prompt them and model and for them good skills while they're interacting with other children. This could occur, during a play date, or it could work in the classroom, but it's much better if these are implemented in real-world settings. Now, Connie mentioned the work of Fred Frankel and his colleagues at UCLA. He's been doing some terrific work on children's friendships training. And one of the studies that was published recently has a manual, and again, this involves parents, as Connie said. It's an intervention that is appropriate for kids 2nd through 5th grade. This study, at least, was done with kids that age. And it targets skills such as conversation, how to enter a peer relation, how to develop a friendship, how to be a good sport, play dates, and also how to handle teasing, which is an issue that many kids have to deal with, and especially kids with autism. They can be often harassed and teased because of their awkward social behavior. One of the great things in the study that was recently published is that 87% of the children who received this friendship training actually showed improvement. So these are great findings. Also, there was a recent review of 66 studies, and they found that 2 interventions for children had particularly strong data to support them. One are these social skills groups that we just talked about, and the other is the use of video modeling. So many of the programs are using video to show the child not only what their own behavior looks like and to be able to talk about it, but also to be able to demonstrate what appropriate social skills look like and what the behaviors are that we're helping the child to learn. So it's great to see these programs being so effective. Now, before we talk about transition to adulthood, I wondered, Holly, if you might share with us some of your own experiences with your son in terms of his development of social skills as he's begun to get older.
Yes, I want to disclose that I've had the extreme fortune of working with Connie and at an amazing school where my son has been involved in a lot of these social skills type of situations, and it's been so helpful and tremendously helpful to him. And now he actually has, where he didn't before, he has this group of friends that I'm positive he would not have connected with without some of this social skills training. We also involved him in social skills summer camps, very intensive camps that were inclusive of mainstream kids, which were tremendously helpful. I can't stress how important having neurotypical children in these programs can be really helpful for modeling and all sorts of things. So, and I just want to say that I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to be on this call because I'm learning so much from you, John, because there are so many things. If I could go back and speak differently around my child, knowing he was listening to me but not able to sort of respond verbally about what he was doing with his autism, about his echolalia, about his stemming and some of the things that he did in his social disconnect. I remember just speaking around him in ways that I think that I would change, just about some of the things he was doing. And the specifics, the way you target specifically, talking about, okay, talk to him about this toy, not that toy. And so I think that's very helpful to hear your point of view. And then lastly, I would just say that, as my son is transitioning into puberty, it's a little bit of a different scenario for us. He had made some pretty tremendous strides in his social skills. But now that puberty is hit and the onslaught of hormones is upon us, and we all know for every kid that can be an issue, but we notice with my son, he has a hard time navigating this surge of hormones, really difficult time understanding the social cues that happen as you transition to middle school. So it's a new set of challenges that we're trying to navigate. So I'm constantly learning more and more with webinars like this and other books and everything I can get my hands on to understand how to transition him more seamlessly through adolescence, through puberty, and then into adulthood.
I'd like to offer a couple of thoughts on childhood fitting in before we move on, if I could. First, when we talk about these groups having success helping kids fit in and avoiding bullying, while I'm all in favor of generally managing bullying in schools, we on the spectrum have to recognize that we are the 1% of the population. So like in the case of my own son, if he would come to me and he would say, you know, Dad, they're calling me a freak and they're making fun of me, the temptation is to think, well, I need to go to school and I need to make those kids stop calling my son a freak. But that's not going to work in the wider world when we're grown-ups. I think the solution that works is to go to school and watch my autistic kid and the other kids behave and watch what happens. What does he do to get called a freak? And then again, just like playing with the toys, you can say, look, Cubby, when you did this, those kids laughed at you, and it wasn't funny. They were laughing at you because they thought you were weird. And you can say, if you don't do this thing, you won't get teased as much. And you may not be able to change every behavior that gets your autistic kid teased, but if you can change half of them, you've made a huge lifelong improvement in his life, and you've also taught him that by learning to meet society's norms, it's going to be immeasurably easier to fit in with the other 99% of the world. Another point that's really important is when you talk about the value of kid-to-kid play and kid-to-kid friendships, always remember that autism is a social communication problem. So if you're a 12-year-old and you can't communicate real effectively with other 12-year-olds, but you can communicate really well with grad students, teachers, and grown-ups, it's going to be more satisfying for you to have exchanges with grown-ups, and you're going to naturally gravitate to those people. So I would encourage anyone to keep mentally agile grown-ups in your kid's life to give him satisfactory exchanges along with talking to children.
Wow, those are wonderful suggestions, John. Thank you so much. And I do think that's a great transition into talking about the movement into adulthood. And you know, as we know, there really is a very large cohort now of individuals that are moving into adulthood. And you know, one of the most challenging things is that we have schools that provide, you know, some help and some therapy often, and some social experiences and a place to go during the day. And this often goes on to age 21 for an individual with special needs. But after that age, it's sort of like falling off a cliff for a lot of families, because there just is very little in the way of services and programs for adults. And so it's a huge challenge in terms of this particular transition, and it's one that Autism Speaks is working very hard to try to fill that gap through our advocacy and legislation to try to get more money that is directed towards transition services and vocational services and residential programs for adults. But when we think about transition to adulthood, one of the sort of 3 points that I've always thought was really helpful are these 3 simple principles. One is that you need to start really early, and by that I mean if you're thinking about the transition to adulthood, you probably want to start somewhere in the mid-teens. You know, 14 is not too early, because there are many, many skills that the adolescent is going to need to learn, everything from self-care to how to work in a vocational environment, how to live by themselves, how to have a checking account, just so many different aspects of what it means to be an adult. And all of these things often have to be taught systematically, and really thinking ahead about, well, where will my son or my daughter fit in as a young adult? Where will they go, and what skills will they need in that new environment? And begin working on those early, and really pull together that team of people that cares about your son or daughter. This can include the teacher, the physician, the therapist, the parents, and with everyone working together, trying to come up with a transition plan. And always trying to make sure that you have thought about, you know, where the child will go after graduation, and have a plan in place so that you don't have that terrible falling off the cliff experience if possible. And, you know, the key issues really are housing, the need for job training, social skills training, just as moving into adolescence brings with it completely new challenges. Similarly, moving into adulthood brings new social challenges. And then finally, there are many issues that have to do with the financial aspects of being a person that has a developmental disorder moving into adulthood and estate planning. So I just wanted to point out that Autism Speaks has recently has a new initiative called Advancing the Future for Adults with Autism. And this is a collaborative program with other organizations. I encourage you to visit our website to learn more. There's a lot of information about vocational training and many of the activities that are going on that have to do with adult services and adult programs. So I think if you have an individual in your life with autism who's an adult, I think you might find some useful information on the website. But I think I'd like to open it up now for some questions to the audience if they'd like to call in. I think that any of us would be happy to try to address your questions. And I have to say, I can't see my screen for the questions, so I think that if the moderator could repeat the question, then it might be helpful.
Okay, we can begin with a couple questions here. Sorry about that. We have a question from Carla. She's asking that she believes these programs should start at an early age for her child with autism. She's tried play groups, and her son feels overwhelmed and shuts down, not to mention this is when bad behavior starts developing. And she's wanting to know if you have any recommendations in that area.
Connie, would you like to address that?
Sure. So if the child is young and is having difficulty with groups of kids, that's a pretty typical response. So we tend to work on developing those play skills in young children so they feel less overwhelmed when they actually know how to play with toys and play with other people. So usually that's an adult in the beginning, and then it's easier to transition to peers. That could be one thing that's going on. It could also be that the play group is just too large and too confusing, overwhelming, so that the child may do better with one peer versus a whole group. But the fact that children don't play well with peers or don't play well with toys is a pretty typical thing that we see with really young children. And I think that's why these new approaches that really focus on play and joint attention and engagement matter, because those are the kinds of skills that children need to develop.
Yes, and I'll just add to that as Dr. Kasari was saying, that's a very typical experience for a young child with autism to be overwhelmed and to start to have some challenging behavior in a play group. And a couple of just ideas that may be helpful. One, I think, as Dr. Kasari was saying, beginning just with one child can be helpful, and you know, picking that child pretty carefully. Often it's helpful to begin with maybe even a slightly older child. It could be a sibling. Siblings are great in terms of helping, say, with a younger child with autism and helping them learn to interact with another child. But you may need to do some instruction for a typically developing peer in terms of how to help out. And then also very carefully structuring the play date in the beginning, so being careful about the activities that you're choosing. And sometimes it's better to set up a situation that just requires what we call parallel play. So you're not really requiring, you know, to have direct interaction, but rather just having an activity that you do around another child. So starting out with that parallel play where it doesn't have so many demands on the child can be helpful as well. So is there another question? Oh, I'm sorry, John. Yes.
The next question that we have is from Philip, who asks, I know my son is autistic and only utters some words repetitively. How can I tell his severity?
Well, you know, one of the, I think one of the helpful things that people are using now is some of the augmentative communication methods. So we now have a wide range of technologies, such as a new application that you can use on an iPhone that allows the child to just touch an icon, and that icon will express a phrase. And for many children who have difficulty in communicating their wants and their desires, this can be really a big breakthrough for them, and you can discover for many kids that they have much more to say than you may realize when we're just relying on spoken language. So I think the use of, you know, what we call augmentative communication and using perhaps some of these new technologies can be very helpful. John, do you have something to add?
Well, I think that the better question for that parent might be, how much progress could I expect my child to make, or how disabled might I expect my child to be when he is 25 or 35, for example? And I think the answer to that really is nobody knows. Some children start out with autism and they have relatively few words and they seem quite disabled, and yet they end up talking like me when they're 40. Others end up with something in the middle, and some don't get much better at all. And when you're looking at your particular 4-year-old, there's absolutely no way for you to tell where your kid will end up, and that's all the more reason to use early and aggressive intervention, because the earlier you start, every study shows the greater the chance for a strongly positive outcome.
And I would just, can I add to that?
Absolutely.
I just want to add to that, that yes, if your son or daughter does not develop language, that at least now we have so many technological advances, ways that children can communicate. I spend a lot of time with nonverbal teenagers. One of my dearest friends is Carly Fleischman, and she blogs and she talks about, well, she's nonverbal and she's a teenager on the spectrum, but she communicates about her feelings and about the things she can't say, and she's one of the people I enjoy connecting with the most. So I would just say that if your child is nonverbal, that they're still there, that they can hear you, that they're connected to you in their own way, and I would just be very conscientious of that and know that just because your child's nonverbal, which sometimes can be devastating, obviously, for families, that there are so many ways that they can still communicate. So for those people who aren't able to get the breakthrough with their kid that the Pete family was lucky enough to have, there's still so much there, and the children have so much to offer, even if they're nonverbal.
Can I add something, Jerry?
Yes.
So I also have a project for nonverbal children who are still nonverbal at age 5 to 8, and we're finding a lot of success with teaching the children how to communicate, whether it's augmented communication or through spoken language. And I think one of the things that's going on that's very sad is that for a lot of children who are not talking very much, they're being denied services. They're being denied speech and language, when in fact those are the very children who need those services. And so I think we still have to, as parents, as professionals, we have to advocate for children to have pretty intensive services, because this is the time when we can really make change, regardless of the age. You know, if the child is making sounds, I just went to a workshop last week where it seemed as if a child who had made any sounds, that was a more positive finding than a child who made no sounds or had no words. So I would get in there aggressively and try to change things for that child so that child could communicate any way that they possibly can.
Yeah, I just want to really underscore what the points that have been made, and in fact, you know, every year Autism Speaks has what we call our top 10 exciting findings of the year, and one of the ones that we identified last year was a report of about 167 children who spoke for the first time as elementary school and young adolescents. So, you know, there used to be this old view that, you know, if a child hadn't developed language by, you know, 5, that then, you know, they would be nonverbal. And so as Dr. Kasari was saying, that often then the, you know, interventions are not provided. But what this study was showing was that really there's potential for development and growth, you know, throughout the lifespan, and, you know, whether it's through spoken language or other methods, we really need to just keep pushing to help that individual express themselves in any way they can.
I think we have time for one more question. This question comes from Esselina. My son is 15 years old and he wants to go to college. What are some of the services and universities we should be looking for?
John, would you like to take that question?
I think that more and more colleges are starting to advertise services for autistic people, but I also think that there are some colleges that are just known as geek-friendly. For example, here in Boston, if you were enrolled at MIT, half the kids in engineering and sciences there probably have Asperger's or autism to some degree. And I think that even if you look at a person in college who has a very mild Asperger's and doesn't seem disabled at all, those people are much more likely to connect with and welcome a person with greater autistic disability than perhaps a totally neurotypical student population. I would look at schools where there's lots of geeks, because I think that geeks are going to be kind of our kind of people, and they're going to welcome us. And there are a number of such schools around the country. I know it sounds like kind of a flip answer, but be assured it's not, you know, because that's been the experience of my own life with my own son.
Can I also say that there are colleges that have specific services on campus to support students on the spectrum? So I would look for those colleges. There's also some colleges, like at UCLA, we have a program called Pathways that's for individuals who have developmental disabilities, and we do have some students with autism in that program, which allows students to have the college experience but are actually taking other kinds of classes that fit their needs. So I think that we are starting to develop some programs, but we have a long ways to go still.
Another place you can look for information on college would be the Wrong Planet website, wrongplanet.net, because there's a huge community there of young adults, college-age people, talking about exactly those kinds of experiences from a first-person perspective. And the founder of Wrong Planet, Alex Plank, is himself on the spectrum, and he's in his early 20s and has now graduated from college.
Well, with that, I think we've gone all the way from early diagnosis through college experience, and I hope that all of you have a little bit better sense of what it means to grow up with autism. And I want to thank Connie and Holly and John for participating in the seminar. And I'm going to turn this back over to Shanna from the This Emotional Life team, and she will help to close out the program. So thank you all very much for this opportunity.
Thank you
so much, Sherry, and thank you to all of our panelists. I think that we would all agree that this was a very fascinating discussion. And with that, we conclude today's This Emotional Life speaker series. We hope that you found this conversation as valuable as we did. And again, we encourage you to answer our survey to tell us what you think. So have a wonderful day, everyone, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Are we clear?
I think we're clear. Thank you so much, everyone. I think